While the world focuses on the coronavirus pandemic, the original epicenter is now flexing its global muscles. China working to extend its power, getting involved in conflicts with India and its other neighbors, and tightening its grip on Hong Kong. NBC News national security and global affairs reporter Dan Duluth joining me now. And Dan, what is China doing for our viewers who don't know, and why now?
So China, on many fronts, is tangling with its neighbors and taking a very aggressive stance. So these are often territorial disputes they have with countries across the South China Sea, with Japan and the East China Sea, a disputed border with India. And so what you see them doing is really acting in a really sharp, aggressive way against Vietnam, against Malaysia, India, Japan, and it's all about asserting what they say is their territorial claims, which are disputed by other countries. And why now? Because they think this is a moment of opportunity. They see the U.S. struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic, and they see allies of the U.S. who are unsure where they stand with President Trump, where they stand with the United States. And so they believe that history is turning at this moment, and this is a time for China to seize its chance.
Dan, the U.S. has responded to the situation with Hong Kong, but have American leaders said much about China's other actions?
They have. It's gotten lost in some of the noise, obviously, from the White House sometimes. Yeah. But the U.S. has accused China of bullying behavior in the South China Sea, where a Vietnamese fishing boat was rammed and sunk by a Chinese survey ship. So the U.S. has had some very strong statements about all of these territorial disputes and all these clashes with neighbors. Japan has called it a really serious situation. But, you know, China is betting that the U.S. really can't do a whole lot here. This is their backyard, and they are pushing the envelope.
What kind of impact do you think these conflicts could have? I mean, as you mentioned, we know that China's relationship with the U.S. has already been hurt by the way China handled the coronavirus. What kind of impact could this have on that already tenuous relationship?
I think we are entering into some kind of Cold War. We're going to see more tensions, and they're going to they're going to increase because we've got 3 U.S. aircraft carriers in the Pacific right now. That's very unusual. The last time was in 2017 during a crisis with North Korea. You have Australia talking about doing more exercises. So I think we're going to have a risk of a miscalculation, of an unintended collision or accident at sea or in the air, and that would be very dangerous. So I think we're entering a really dangerous phase.
Yeah, it is serious stuff. Keep an eye on this space. And Dan, I just have to say, in this era of the coronavirus, whenever we have people on, we always notice their bookcases, whether they're reporters or guests. And I think that you just have set the new record, best and most books. So I know our team is noticing that and is probably giving you a round of applause behind the scenes right now.
Okay, I'm glad it looks good.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.